"Refills are your job, sweetheart." The words landed across a two-top table near the beverage line, and the corporal who said them was already turning back to his friends before he finished, the way a man does when he is certain of the answer he will get. His empty cup slid the last few inches across the laminate and came to rest against a manila folder. He did not look to see whether it had reached her. He looked at the three soldiers at his own table to make sure they had heard, because the saying of it had never really been for her at all. The dining facility was loud in the way those places are at mid-morning, a low, steady roar of trays and boots, and 100 conversations stacked on top of one another. Steam rose off the serving line in slow curtains. Fluorescent light flattened everything to the same pale color. The tables, the trays, the faces, the day. Somewhere, a coffee urn hissed and refilled itself. Outside the tall windows, the sky was a hard, clean winter blue, and inside it smelled of eggs and burnt coffee and floor cleaner, and it was an ordinary morning on a large joint post. And nothing about the woman at the two-top by the beverage station suggested it would become anything else. She was in civilian clothes, a plain red pullover, the kind a person wears on a long drive with the heater running. In front of her were a paper cup of black coffee and the folder, and she was reading the folder with the patient attention of someone who has read a great many forms in her life and expects to read a great many more before she is done. She had reported to the post overnight, off a flight and a rental car, and 4 hours of thin sleep in temporary quarters. She had not yet drawn a uniform or an identification card or a permanent room. She had a coffee and a folder and a seat with her back to the wall and her face to the door, and for the moment that was enough, and had been enough in worse rooms than this one. She looked at the cup that had arrived against her folder. Then she looked, without hurry, at the young man who had sent it. She did not raise her voice. She did not raise anything at all. She reached out, took the cup by its rim, and set it back down at the far edge of the table, at the far edge of his reach, the way you return a thing to its owner, without comment and without heat. Then she squared the loose pages in the folder with 2 fingers, a small, precise motion, the kind of motion a person makes 10,000 times until it stops being a motion and becomes a habit of the hands. And she went back to reading. Corporal Jesse Doyle grinned. He was 22 years old and built for the gym mirror, and he had an audience, which was the only thing he had ever truly required to be happy. "New hire's a little slow," he said, loud enough to carry 3 tables in every direction. "Somebody show her where the pot is." At the serving line, a man behind the pass-through stopped wiping the steel. His name was Elwood Barlow, and most of the young soldiers who ate at his tables 3 times a day called him Woody, or Sir, or nothing at all, because he was a heavy-set civilian in an apron who ran the dining facility and refilled their urns and kept their trays hot, and there was no reason for any of them to know that he had spent 26 years in the Army and retired a master sergeant. There was no reason for them to know that he had spent a good part of those years around men and women whose stillness had a particular quality to it, a quality that could not be taught in any schoolhouse and could not be faked by anyone who had not earned it, a quality he was looking at right now across his own dining room over a tray of scrambled eggs. He watched the woman in the red pullover the way he had once watched a tree line at last light. She had taken the seat with her back to the wall and her face to the door, without appearing to choose it, the way you breathe without choosing it. She had not startled when the cup hit her folder. She had not startled at anything since she sat down. And when she moved without waste, the small, hard economy of a person who has learned, somewhere, that motion costs something, and that you spend it only when you must. "Watch that table," Barlow said quietly to the young server beside him, and the server, who had expected an instruction about ketchup or napkins, blinked and did not understand, and watched the table anyway, because the old man had a way of being obeyed. At the two-top, the woman turned a page. Between her and the corporal, at the very edge of the laminate, the empty cup sat where she had placed it, untouched. A small line drawn across the morning that the corporal could not see and would not have believed was there, and would have laughed at if you had told him. For a while, it was only noise, and noise is cheap, and she had heard a great deal of cheap noise in her life and learned the exact price of all of it. A tray went down somewhere across the room, the flat, sudden clatter of aluminum on tile, and the whole dining facility flinched the way a room of soldiers will, 100 heads turning at once toward the sound before the mind catches up to the ears. One person did not turn. She did not so much as blink. She finished the line she was reading, then lifted her coffee and drank, unhurried, while the room settled back into itself and laughed at whoever had dropped the tray and went back to its eggs. Barlow saw it, and it confirmed the thing he had been afraid he was right about. A room of soldiers jumped, and one woman did not. And a man who has spent his life around soldiers knows exactly what that means, and knows exactly what it costs a person to become someone who does not flinch when the world drops something behind them. Doyle, for his part, had decided she was a game worth playing because she had not given him the one thing he wanted, which was a reaction he could have used. Silence he did not know what to do with, and a man who does not know what to do with a thing will often decide to break it. He leaned back in his chair and studied her the way a boy studies an anthill he has already decided to step on. "You even allowed to sit there?" he said. "That's for personnel. You got a badge, or you just wander in off the road?" She answered without looking up in a few precise words. She told him which building and processing sent new arrivals to, and which window inside it, and what time that window opened, and the fact that the dining facility was open to anyone with legitimate business on the post before then. It was exact. It was base-specific and current and correct to the minute, the kind of thing a person knows when she has arrived on a great many posts in a great many years and taught herself to read each one fast in the first hour before it could cost her anything. It was not the kind of thing a food service hire hired last week would recite from memory to a stranger. Doyle laughed. "Look at that," he said to his table. "She talks." "When it's worth it," the woman said, and drank her coffee. And the flatness of it, the sheer lack of heat, made one of the specialists at his table snort into his own cup, and Doyle's grin tightened by a single degree, because the snort had not been at her. Barlow came around the line with the tall steel pitcher and made a slow circuit of the nearby tables, topping off urns and cups that did not need it, drifting closer by degrees. When he reached the beverage station, he was close enough to see her hands. She reached for her cup, and her sleeve rode up an inch as she did, and along the inside of her left wrist, he saw the scar, old and shiny and puckered, the unmistakable shape of a burn that had healed a very long time ago, the kind of scar a beam or a plate or a length of hot metal leaves when it comes down across a person who was reaching for something more important than her own arm. He had seen scars like that. He had a smaller one of his own on the back of his hand, from a lesser night than the one that had made hers. He said nothing. He filled a caddy that did not need filling, but his shoulders had changed, squared without his deciding it, the old posture climbing back up the length of a body that had worn an apron for 11 years, and remembered all at once what it had been shaped for before that. At Doyle's table, the specialist who had not laughed, a young man named Ortega, quietly reached across and slid the sugar caddy to within the woman's reach in case she wanted it, and then looked embarrassed to have done it, as if kindness were a thing you could be caught at. She glanced at him and gave him a small nod, the kind of acknowledgement that costs nothing and means a great deal to the person who receives it. and it was the single decent thing that happened at that table for a long while. Barlow carried his pitcher back behind the line and set it down and stepped into the little office off the kitchen. He put his hand on the phone. He stood like that a moment, his hand on the receiver, working out who he would even call and what he would even say. Then he took his hand off the phone, because he was not sure yet what he was seeing, only that he was seeing it, and that he had seen it before, a long time and a whole life ago, and that it had not ended the way the loud young man out there expected it to end. The trouble with an audience is that it is never satisfied, and Corporal Doyle had begun to perform for a larger one. 2 more soldiers had drifted over and pulled chairs to his table, drawn the way young men are drawn to the sound of one of their own enjoying himself at someone else's expense, and now there were 5 of them, and the jokes had grown teeth. He had given her a name. Coffee, he called her now, jerking his chin at her across the aisle, and he narrated her folder to the table, inventing what was in it, a schedule of pot scrubbing, a route of tables to bus, a list of everything he had decided her small life must contain. The table laughed on cue, all of them but Ortega, who had gone quiet and was looking hard at the floor and at his own hands. "Watch this," Doyle said, and snapped his fingers at her twice, sharp across the aisle, the way a man calls a dog he owns. "Sweetheart. Cup." The woman raised her eyes from the folder and looked at him. She held his gaze 1 beat longer than he expected, 1 beat longer than was comfortable, and in that single beat, something moved behind her stillness, something that had nothing at all to do with a dining facility or a coffee cup or a Tuesday, something old and level and entirely without fear, the way deep water is without fear of the wind on its surface. For 1 second, Corporal Jesse Doyle felt a cold thing he could not name walk slowly up the back of his neck and stand the small hairs there on end. Then she lowered her eyes to the folder again and released him, and he laughed it off, loudly, too loudly, because laughing was easier than sitting with the thing he had just felt and could not explain to himself. Behind the line, Barlow leaned on the pass-through beside the young server and spoke to him without taking his eyes off the room. "Let me tell you about a master chief I watched get spoken to like furniture once," he said. "Years ago. Different world. By a lieutenant fresh out of the schoolhouse, all creases and confidence, who didn't know the old man from the guy who mopped the passageway. Real polished, that lieutenant. Real sure of every word out of his own mouth." The server waited, a rag forgotten in his hand. "That old chief let him run for about 10 minutes, Barlow said. Didn't say a word. Just took it, the way you'd take weather. And when the truth finally came out about who that old man was and what he'd done, and how many people were walking around alive because of him, that lieutenant spent the next 2 years wishing he could buy those 10 minutes back for any money on this earth. He never could. Nobody ever can." He straightened slowly and set the rag down. "Some people are quiet because they've got nothing to say, son. And some people are quiet because they already said everything a person ever needs to say, a long way from here, in places you and I couldn't stand to hear described over breakfast. The whole trick of a life is telling those 2 kinds apart before you open your mouth. Most people never learn it. Some people learn it all at once, on a bad morning, and never forget it again." The server looked out at the woman in the red pullover. "Which one is she?" "Son," Barlow said. "I've been trying to be sure for 25 minutes, and the truth is I was sure in the first 30 seconds. I'm just waiting on the rest of the room to catch up." If you have ever watched the young forget what the old once paid and wanted to reach through the noise and stop it before it went too far, stay with this one. Subscribe to the Veteran Vault, so the stories of the quiet ones keep finding the people who need to hear them. At the table, Doyle turned his chair fully toward her now, squaring himself to her, settling in with his arms crossed like a man who believes he has all morning and intends to spend every minute of it. And the 4 soldiers with him turned too, chairs scraping, so that the whole table faced the woman by the beverage line, like a jury that had already decided the case and only wanted to enjoy the sentencing. She gathered her folder to leave. It was time. In-processing would be opening its window, and she had a long day of other windows and other signatures ahead of her. And she had gotten what she had come into the warmth for, which was a black coffee and a quiet corner and 20 minutes to read before the day took her. She closed the folder, tucked it under her arm, picked up her cup, and stood, and turned toward the aisle that led to the doors and the cold, bright morning beyond them. Doyle stood too, and stepped into the aisle, and put his hand on the back of her chair. Not on her, but close enough to be a wall, close enough to be a decision. "We're not done," he said, and the grin was still there, but the eyes behind it had gone flat, the way a bully's eyes go flat when the game is slipping away from him, and he decides to hold it in place by force, because force is the only tool he has ever fully trusted. "You didn't get my refill, sweetheart?" The room, which had been half watching all along, went quiet in the wrong way. The way a room goes quiet when it senses something ugly coming and decides, table by table, to become very interested in its own trays. She set the folder back down on the two-top. She set the cup down beside it, squared, deliberate. And she stood there, her weight even over both feet, her hands loose and open at her sides. And she looked at the young man, blocking her path with the particular calm of a person who has already counted the exits, already measured the distance, already understood in the first half-second, without any effort at all, exactly how the next 4 seconds would go if she chose to let them go that way. The angle of him, the chair, the table corner, the soft, undefended places a body keeps that a body like hers had been trained a long time ago to find without looking. She did not choose to let them go that way. She had learned, a long time ago, and at a terrible price, that the loudest thing in any room is a person who does not need to be. And she had spent years being the very quietest thing in rooms, far worse than this one. And she was not about to spend a young man's whole future to save herself 20 seconds of a coffee cup. "Corporal," she said evenly, "step out of the aisle." "Or what?" Doyle said, and behind him, a specialist lifted a phone and started filming, laughing, narrating it low for whatever feed it was bound for. Ortega said, "Doyle, man, knock it off," with real strain in his voice now, and Doyle waved him down without looking, the way you wave off a fly at a picnic, and the line had been crossed, not with a blow, but with something that in its own way was almost worse. A woman cornered and filmed and jeered in front of 100 people who had every one of them decided that it was not their business and their eggs were getting cold. Behind the serving line, Barlow untied nothing and said nothing, but he came out from behind the steel, wiping his hand slowly on his apron, and he began to cross the room toward the two-top. Not fast, but with the unhurried and absolute certainty of a senior non-commissioned officer who has made his decision and is simply waiting for his own boots to carry it the rest of the way there. He did not reach the table first. At the far end of the dining facility, the double doors swung open, and a hush came in with the daylight, and the hush started at the doors and began to roll down the long room toward the beverage line like a wave coming up a beach, table by table, silence spreading outward from the entrance, and the corporal, who had his back to the doors and his eyes locked on the woman, did not feel it coming, and had no idea that the whole shape of his morning had just walked in behind him. Barlow reached the aisle and put himself squarely into it, between Doyle and the woman, without laying a hand on either of them, which is a thing only a certain kind of man ever learns how to do. "Son," Barlow said, low, meant for the corporal alone, the voice of a man who has said hard, true things to young men his entire life and never once enjoyed it. "You have no idea in this world who you're talking to." Doyle laughed, but it was a thinner laugh than any of the ones before it. "It's a cook, Woody. Relax. Go stir something." "It's all right, Master Sergeant," the woman said. Barlow turned his head. She had said it quietly, almost kindly, and she had said, Master Sergeant, his rank, the rank he had not worn in 11 years, and had not told her, and did not have stitched on his apron, or printed on any badge, or written anywhere in that entire room. She had read it off him the way he had spent the last half hour reading her, off the set of his shoulders, and the flat, steady level of his eyes, and the plain fact that he had walked toward the trouble instead of away from it, when every other soul in the building had found something to study on their plates. She had made him before he had finished making her. His eyes widened by a fraction, one old soldier registering that he had been seen clean through by another, and something passed between the two of them across that narrow aisle, in complete silence, that the corporal standing 3 feet away was not equipped to see, and would not have understood if he had. Down the length of the dining facility, the wave had nearly reached them. A knot of senior officers had come in through the doors for the leadership summit that had brought half the post's general officers and colonels to the schoolhouse that week, and they were moving up the center aisle in a loose formation of stars and eagles, and around them and ahead of them, the room was coming to its feet, table by table. Soldiers standing not because anyone had called them to attention, but because that much rank moving through a room pulls people up out of their chairs the way the moon pulls water, without asking, without needing to. Trays were set down. Forks went quiet. Conversations died mid-word. And Corporal Doyle, still planted in the aisle, still half turned toward the woman, still wearing the last thin remnant of a grin that no longer had a single thing behind it, was one of the last men in that entire room still seated in his own mind, the very last to understand that the morning had stopped, some time ago, being about him at all. What the boy in the pressed uniform did not know was that the next few minutes were going to teach him something he would carry and be shaped by for the rest of his natural life. If you want to be standing there when the truth comes up the aisle, subscribe to the Veteran Vault and stay with her all the way to the end of it. One figure separated from the knot of officers near the doors. He was an older man, silver at the temples, unhurried, and he wore 2 stars on his chest, and he had stopped mid-stride the very moment his eyes crossed the beverage line, the way a man stops dead when he sees, across a crowded room and across a span of years, a face he had long ago made his peace with never seeing again. And then he started down the center aisle, alone, past the standing tables and the cooling trays and the 100 quiet soldiers, straight toward the two-top by the beverage station and the woman in the plain red pullover standing beside it. She was not in a dining facility anymore. She was in a walled compound at night, in a country of dust and cold stars, and a wind that carried the smell of wood smoke and diesel in the year 2013. And she was 25 years old, and her call sign was Lodestar. She had been attached to a ranger element as a cultural support team officer, one of the women the Army had begun sending forward to do the work the Rangers could not do themselves, to search and to speak with the women and the children in the compounds they hid in the dark, because in that country a strange man could not, and a mission could turn, and lives could turn, on what a terrified mother would say quietly to another woman, and would never in this life say to a rifle and a helmet. She had trained for it until it was reflex and past reflex. She had learned enough of the language to be gentle in it, which mattered more than most people back home would ever understand. She wore the same kit as the men, and carried the same weight up the same mountains, and moved the same way, quiet and exact. And on the net she was lodestar. And the Rangers had stopped noticing after the first few weeks that she was a woman, and had started noticing only that she was steady, and that she was good, and that when it was bad, she did not come apart. The compound went wrong the way they sometimes did, without warning and all at once. A breach charge on an interior wall, and then that wall, which had been older and weaker and wetter at its base than anyone could have known in the dark, coming down in a long, slow avalanche of mud brick with a sound like the world clearing its throat. And in the collapse, in the very place where no living soul was supposed to be, 2 children, a boy of perhaps 7 and a smaller girl, frozen against the base of the wall as it came, too frightened to run, their eyes enormous in the green of the night vision. She went for them before anyone told her to. There was no decision in it. Not really. The decision had been made years earlier, in every hour of training, and every mile of every ruck march, and every cold morning she had chosen to become the kind of person she was becoming, so that when the one moment finally came, there was no deciding left to do. There was only the going. "Ma'am, go low. I've got the corner," Sergeant Aaron Mercer said, and he put himself between the children and the falling wall. He was 26 years old. He was from a small town in a state she could no longer name aloud, without her voice doing something she did not permit it to do in front of other people. He got his shoulders and his back under the worst of the corner as it came down, and he held it, held the impossible weight of it for 2 seconds, 3, exactly and precisely long enough for her to reach the children and gather them in, one under each arm, small and shaking and impossibly light, and carry them out low and fast across the open ground, while the rest of the wall came down in a roar behind her, and a beam caught her across the inside of the left wrist and laid its brand there for the rest of her life. She has carried heavier things than a coffee cup. She has carried 2 children across open ground, under a sky full of noise, with her ears ringing and her arm on fire. And she has carried, every single day since, in every ordinary room of every ordinary year, the memory of the man who bought those 2 children their whole lives and did not walk out into the cold to spend 1 hour of his own. The children lived. She would learn their names later, and she would never once forget them, and she kept a photograph she did not show to anyone. Sergeant Aaron Mercer did not follow her out of the compound. A year on a flight line in Kandahar with the heat coming up off the tarmac in visible sheets, she had stood at attention in a clean uniform, while 2 hands lowered a pale ribbon over her head and pinned a silver star to her chest, and the colonel who pinned it, a hard, decent, unsentimental man named Warren Kilbride, who had commanded the task force and had read every line of every page of what had happened at that wall, had leaned in close, so close that only she could hear it under the noise of the engines. "Lieutenant Calder," he had said, "Lodestar. Don't you ever let anyone tell you what you are. You already know. And so do I. That's 2 of us, and that's enough." She had carried that too, folded up small and kept in an inner pocket of herself, through all the ordinary rooms and all the ordinary years since, through every single person who looked at a quiet woman in plain clothes and saw someone to fetch their coffee and bust their table. The ribbon had weight. The empty place in the formation where Sergeant Mercer should have been standing had far more. She had never once corrected the people who underestimated her in the years that followed, and there had been many of them, in airports and waiting rooms and rental car lines, and now in a dining hall. It was not pride that kept her quiet, and it was not weakness either. It was something Mercer had understood without ever having the words for it, And Kilbride had understood, and a handful of others scattered across her life had understood, which was that a person who has actually stood at the wall has nothing left to prove to a stranger who has not, and no reason on earth to spend her breath proving it. The ones who needed to announce themselves were, in her long experience, generally the ones who had the least to announce. So she let them talk. She let them assume. She had buried the only opinions that had ever truly weighed anything to her, one of them under a folded flag, and after that, the opinion of a loud young man about who should fetch his coffee simply did not reach the places in her where it might once have stung. It was, in its way, a kind of freedom, purchased at a price she would not have chosen and could never give back. The memory closed the way it always closed, on that empty place, and released her, and set her gently back down in a dining facility on a joint post going silent around her, with a 2-star general walking up the center aisle toward the table where her folder lay closed beside a cooling paper cup of coffee. Doyle felt the room change and read it wrong, in the last way a man in his position could afford to read anything. He felt the standing, the hush, the whole weight of the room's attention swinging up the aisle like a searchlight. And because he was a young man who had spent the entire morning making himself the center of that room, he assumed for one more disastrous moment that the change was about him, that he had won something, that the crowd was rising to its feet to watch him finish what he had started. So he did the thing that a smarter man, or a kinder one, or merely a luckier one, would not have done. He reached out and swept her folder off the 2-top with the back of his hand. It hit the floor and fanned open, and the pages went sliding across the tile in a long, pale spray. Her orders and her records and her official photograph and her in-processing packet spreading out in a fan around his own boots. "Pick it up," Doyle said. "That's your job too, sweetheart." A woman at the next table put her hand over her mouth. The specialist with the phone slowly lowered it, the laughter dying on his face, as though someone had reached over and turned a dial. Captain Tessa Calder looked down at the pages scattered on the floor around the corporal's boots. Then she crouched, unhurried, and began to gather them, drawing the loose sheets together with the same 2-fingered precision she had used to square them an hour before, when the worst thing in her morning had been a stranger's empty cup. She permitted it. There is a kind of patience in this world that is not weakness, though it looks exactly like weakness to a certain kind of man. It is a debt being counted, quietly, in a ledger, the loud man cannot see, and does not know exists. And she had learned to keep that ledger in far harder places than a dining hall, and she had learned that it always, always balances in the end. Ortega dropped to one knee to help her, gathering pages, and he turned one sheet right side up to hand it back to her, and stopped. He was looking at the top of a standard in-processing form, at the name block and the rank printed there in plain, flat government letters, and the blood went out of his face all at once. He stood up slowly, the page still in his hand. He stepped back from Doyle, one step and then another, deliberately putting distance between himself and the man he had spent the whole morning sitting beside, the way a person steps back from something he has just realized is armed. The figure from the aisle was close now, close enough that his shadow fell across the fanned pages on the floor, and Barlow, standing at the corporal's shoulder, said 4 quiet words that carried more weight than everything Doyle had said all morning stacked together. "On your feet, Corporal." And for the first time that day, Corporal Jesse Doyle heard something in a man's voice that put him on his feet before he had consciously decided to stand. A hand reached down into the spread of papers, an older hand, weathered and sure, and began to help gather them. And on the cuff above that hand was the plain, hard-embroidered stitching of a general officer's rank. Major General Warren Kilbride crouched on the tile floor of the dining facility in front of 100 standing soldiers and gathered the last of the scattered pages, and rose and handed them across to the woman in the red pullover with both hands. "Captain Calder," he said. The word captain went through Corporal Doyle like snowmelt off a mountain. Kilbride was not looking at the corporal. He had not once looked at the corporal. He was looking at her, and there was something in his weathered face that the whole silent room could see plainly, and that had nothing whatsoever to do with rank. The recognition of one person who has stood at a certain kind of wall for another person who has stood at the very same kind, across all the years and all the miles and all the ordinary distance between a bad night in a far country and a Tuesday morning in a dining hall. "General," she said, "it's good to see you, sir." Her voice had not changed once all morning, through the cup and the snapping fingers and the folder on the floor, and it did not change now. Kilbride reached into the inner pocket of his uniform and took out a coin. It was a Major General's challenge coin, heavy in the hand, 2 stars worked into the face of the metal, the kind of coin a man in his position gives perhaps a handful of times across an entire career, and never lightly, and only ever into the keeping of someone who has earned a thing that a handshake is too small to hold. He did not press it into her palm. He set it down on the 2-top table, deliberately, with a small, flat click against the laminate, in the plain view of the entire room, the oldest and simplest and least deniable form of respect that one soldier can pay to another, and he left 2 fingers resting on it for a moment before he drew his hand away. "I pinned the silver star on this officer on a flight line in Kandahar," Kilbride said, and he did not raise his voice, because a room that quiet does not require a man to raise his voice. "Her call sign was Lodestar. She went in with a ranger element, and when a wall came down on 2 children who should never have been there, she carried them out from under it, under fire, and she lost a better soldier than most of us will ever be, holding that wall so she could. There is not a person standing in this room who has had a harder morning than the one this officer had that night." He let it sit in the silence a moment, and the silence held it. "So when I walked in here just now, and I saw where she was sitting, and I saw who was standing over her, I would like very much to be certain that I understand exactly what it is I have walked in on." Behind him, Elwood Barlow had come to attention. An old man in a food service apron, standing straighter than he had stood in 11 years, chin level, shoulders squared, his eyes bright and fixed on nothing at all, honoring her in the only language he had ever completely trusted in his life. And he wasn't the only one. Around the room, here and there among the standing tables, other old habits were surfacing in bodies that had not stood quite like this in years. A sergeant first class near the doors had come to attention without being told, her chin up, her eyes forward. A retired colonel eating breakfast with his grandson had risen and set his napkin down and stood the way a man stands at a graveside. It moved through the room in a quiet wave, this recognition, passing from the ones who understood immediately what a general officer's coin set down, in plain view, actually meant to the ones who only understood that it meant something, and that the something was large. Even the specialists at Doyle's own table were on their feet now, staring at the coin, at the captain, at the 2 stars, and then at the corporal in their midst, with an expression that had shifted in the space of a minute, from amusement to a careful and deliberate distance, the look of men who have just recognized which side of a line they wish very badly to have been standing on all along. And Corporal Jesse Doyle's face went through its stations one by one, and the whole room watched it go. First the confusion, the ghost of the grin still hanging at the corners of his mouth, while his mind refused, flatly refused, to accept the words it was being handed. Then the disbelief, as Captain and Silver Star and Lodestar arranged themselves, slowly, and then all at once, into a single shape that he could not unsee and could not argue with. Then the recognition, full and cold and total, of the coin on the cheap table and the 2 stars standing over it, and the sweetheart he had snapped his fingers at across an aisle like a man calling a dog. And last of all, the horror, the pure, clean, falling horror of a young man who understands, all at once, and irreversibly, and far, far too late, precisely and completely what he has done, and to whom, and in front of exactly how many witnesses. He opened his mouth. Nothing at all came out of it. First Sergeant Dominic Kane arrived at a fast walk, having been found and sent by someone with a phone and a good deal more sense than the man who had been filming. He took in the whole of the scene, the way senior non-commissioned officers take in a scene, in a single sweep that missed nothing. The general, the coin, the captain, the pages, the standing room, and his own corporal frozen and gray in the dead center of all of it. "Corporal Doyle," Kane said very quietly, and quiet from a first sergeant is a great deal louder than shouting. "Outside. Right now." The room did not sit back down. It stayed on its feet, and it was not standing for the 2 stars anymore, or not only for them. It was standing for the woman in the plain red pullover, for the thing the plain red pullover had been quietly covering all morning long, and the coin gleamed there on the cheap laminate table between them. 2 small stars catching the flat fluorescent light, and nowhere in that entire dining facility, from the doors to the serving line, was there a single soul left laughing. Outside, in the cold, bright winter air, First Sergeant Kane began to bring the hammer down. He was a good first sergeant, which meant he was already 10 steps out ahead of himself, already building the list of it in his head, the counseling statements, and the corrective training, and the paperwork that would trail a soldier for a long time, the phone that would be confiscated within the hour, and the video that would be found and killed before it could travel, the reckoning that his platoon would hear about, one way or another, of what happens when a soldier of his disrespects a stranger in a dining hall because he has decided she is beneath his notice. He had his corporal backed against the invisible wall of it, and Doyle was taking it grave-faced and silent, and Kane was, by his own standards, barely warming up. The door of the dining facility opened behind them, letting out a breath of warm air and the smell of coffee. Captain Calder came out, her folder under her arm again, squared away, the coin now in the pocket of her red pullover, and she stopped a few feet from the 2 men and waited to be noticed. "First Sergeant," she said. Kane came to attention at once. "Ma'am, on behalf of my unit, and myself, I want to—" "I know," she said gently. "I heard all of it in there, First Sergeant, and I'll hear the rest of it if I have to. That's not why I came out here." She looked at Doyle for a long moment, at the 22-year-old face still hunting for something useful to do with itself, still waiting for the ground to open, and then she looked back to Kane. "He's young, First Sergeant. Correct him. Do not crush him." She said it the way a person says a thing she has considered carefully in advance, though the truth was she had considered this particular thing only in the last 90 seconds, because she had been rehearsing the substance of it, without ever once knowing she was rehearsing it, for 13 straight years. "I have buried better men than the one he almost became this morning. I would a great deal rather help you make him into a better one than stand here and watch you end him over a coffee cup in a bad hour. Give him the chance the good ones never got to have." Kane held her eyes for a moment, and then he nodded. Once, the short, hard nod of a professional accepting an assignment, considerably more difficult than the easy and satisfying one he had been about to carry out. "Yes, ma'am. Honor the ones who carry it in silence. If this story has reached something in you this morning, subscribe to the Veteran Vault, and let this captain's story go and find the people who most need to hear it. 3 days later, At the schoolhouse where Captain Calder had reported to instruct, a corporal was waiting in the corridor when she arrived with her coffee and her keys. He was in uniform, and the uniform was correct. Every last part of it squared away and pressed and worn the way it was meant to be worn. And when she came around the corner, he came to attention and rendered a salute. And it was a good salute, held and level and meant all the way through. "Ma'am," Corporal Doyle said, "I was wrong. There's no excuse for it, and I'm not going to give you one. I'm sorry." She looked at him for a moment, weighing it, because she had learned to tell a real thing from its imitation a long time ago, in a place where the difference had mattered a great deal more than it did in a hallway. Then she returned the salute, and it was a real salute, crisp and full and complete, not a wave-off and not a formality, the salute of an officer acknowledging a soldier, rather than the salute of a person grudgingly accepting an apology. "Then be better than the morning you had, Corporal," she said. "Be better tomorrow than you were today. And then get up and do it again the day after that, and the day after that, for as long as they let you wear it. That is the whole job. That's all it ever was, for any of us." He held the salute until she dropped hers, and then he squared away and went. And he walked out of that corridor a little taller than he had walked into it, which is, in the end, the only direction that ever counts for anything. Her first class filed in a few minutes later, and the very first soldier through the door, 10 minutes early, was Specialist Ortega, the one who had never once laughed, the one who had slid a sugar caddy across an aisle to a stranger for no reason but that it was the decent thing to do, and who had been the only person at that whole table to do a single decent thing all morning. He would turn out to be one of the finest soldiers she ever taught, and she would tell him so, years down the road, and he would not believe her, the way the good ones almost never do. Corporal Doyle came to that first class, too. He sat in the second row, and he took notes, and he did not once try to be the center of the room, and when the block of instruction turned, as her blocks often did, to the difference between the soldier a person appears to be, and the soldier a person actually is, he listened with the particular stillness of a young man learning something he intends to keep. She did not single him out. She did not tell the class what had happened in the dining hall 3 days before, and neither, so far as she ever learned, did he. Word traveled anyway, the way word always does on a post, but it traveled without her help, and by the time it reached the far corners of the base it had become, correctly, a story less about a corporal's bad morning than about the kind of officer a person could turn out to be under a plain red pullover. It was, she thought, the better version of the story to have loose in the world, and she let it run. On the corner of her desk, beside her nameplate, sat a Major General's challenge coin, 2 small stars catching the light from the window, kept, and some mornings, in the quiet before the class filed in, she would sit with it a moment in her open hand, and she would say a name aloud, quietly, once, to no one in the room, the name of a sergeant from a small town who got his shoulders under a falling wall in the dark, so that 2 children he had never met and would never know could grow up somewhere far away in the light. The debt was still being counted. It had only, at long last, after 13 years, begun to be paid forward. Some warriors fade quietly into the years, but the valor never leaves them. Honor the ones who carry it in silence. Thank you for staying and watching. Subscribe to the Veteran Vault for more.